This is a quick overview and recap of the lecture on liberalism. Following this lecture, you should be able to become more familiar with not only the dominant theories of international relations, but liberalism in particular. In this lecture, we'll be talking about human nature, institutions, and corporations as key concepts of the liberal tradition, and so you should be able to talk about those easily as well. Likewise, just as in our lecture on realism, you should be able to identify key authors within the liberal discourses and incorporate a variety of ideas into your own discussions. So we'll give you a brief overview of what liberalism is. We'll provide some definitions and look at the ways in which they are discussed. And then we're going to break down interpretations of liberal approaches. And throughout all of this, we're going to be comparing it to the realist ideas that we talked about last week. Very briefly, there are 5 key tenets of liberalism that I portrayed to you during the lecture. The first is that human beings have a capacity to reason. This means that they can think about how they want to act and then put that into action. So within that, there's also the possibility for working with other people. They can collaborate and they can help each other, so mutual aid. This concern for welfare, or this idea that we can help one another, actually enables progress. So within liberalism, generally, there's this idea that things can get better. Moreover, individuals are not necessarily innately bad, and I put that term in brackets, and human behavior instead is created and perpetuated by the structures of the system that we put in place. So with this in mind, there is the idea that international cooperation is possible and that war can be avoided and possibly eradicated as well. Within the liberal reform program, you see various things, one of them being democracy and accountability, another thing being free trade and interdependence, and the last one being international institutions. And these are some of the ideas that we talked about during our lecture. There are many different strands of liberal theory, so I began the lecture by taking you through a couple different ways that we can think of them. In general, they all work on the premise that war is unnatural and irrational, and so already you're going to start seeing the challenges that this makes to a realist tradition of international relations. They're also aware that war serves the interests of the ruling elite and authoritarian regimes, and so there's this distinction to be made about how this plays out for people on the ground as well. They also look at different ways that you can reduce the likelihood of war, and we did talk about the democratic peace theory or democratic governance and free trade as well. So the first definition I gave you is from Tim Dunn, and he writes that liberalism is an ideology whose central concern is the liberty of the individual. So you can find this in his edited book, Discipline and Diversity, which you can see up here in the upper corner of the slide. He goes on to say that we can see the establishment of the state as a necessary part of preserving liberty, either from harm by other individuals or by the state. So the state is still providing a particular role that helps individuals avoid being vulnerable, but they're doing it in a different way with a different end. He goes on to say that the state is part of a relationship between it and its people, and the state is not the master, and that putting democratic institutions in place is one way of making sure that this happens. He does go on to say that liberalism is primarily a theory of government, and it is again concerned with order, and this ties back to the ideas that Nick Renger talks about, but also equality, so the notion of justice, that it comes from within a particular community. And again, you should begin to see how this challenges a realist way of looking at the world. On the other hand, we look at Viotti and Caupi in their International Relations Theory book, and they provide 4 key assumptions on liberalism. The first of which, states as well as non-state transnational actors are important entities in world politics. So what they're starting to do is open up that black box that we identified last week. The second thing they say is that the state is not always a unitary actor, and the worst aspects of anarchy can be overcome as institutions and ideas matter to both states and non-state actors that operate transnationally across borders. So the story and the characters within that story is opening up, and it's not just about states anymore. Third, they say that liberals see economic or other forms of interdependence or interconnectedness among both states and non-state actors as tending to have, if not a pacifying, then at least a moderating effect on behavior. So the system can be used to quell the worst forms of state behavior, again challenging a realist outlook. Finally, they say that the state-society relation is critical to understanding international relations, and as a result of that, the agenda of international politics is extensive. So what they're doing, and this is what the final point talks about, is that they are rejecting that military security focus. And again, it's going back to the point that Tim Dunn makes about how it's not just about the state, but opening up the state as well. So within these definitions, we can begin to talk about a few key concepts. The first is the democratic peace thesis, and this is the basic idea that liberal democracies are less likely to go to war with one another, and we did watch this video on YouTube to help explain it. This is challenged or contrasted with the idea of collective security, and I gave you a definition by Roberts and Kinsbury. Collective security refers to an arrangement where each state in the system accepts that the security of one is a concern of all and agrees to join in a collective response to aggression. So here's the idea that is embodying this notion that states can come together, they can agree upon outcomes, and they can work together to achieve that particular end. So we're beginning to see where this idea of cooperation might begin to come from. There are many varieties of liberalism: liberal internationalism, idealism, and liberal institutionalism. And then they are all broken down into the neo approaches, so then you go on to get neoliberal internationalism, neo-idealism, and neoliberal institutionalism. And I took you through these briefly in class. Again, the same caveat applies. There's more information on the slides than what we went through during the lecture, but these slides are meant to be used as a resource for you to begin to do the readings, but also enhance your understanding of the readings. So the first idea, liberal internationalism, and this is associated with Immanuel Kant and Jeremy Bentham, and these are their books. And we spent quite a bit of time talking about perpetual peace during the lecture. The idea of perpetual peace is the belief that reason could deliver freedom and justice in international relations. You don't necessarily need a world government as the end result of this, but there's this underlying assumption or belief that there is a society that can bring everybody together at the international level. And here is a major difference between the realist and the liberal tradition. We're not talking about a system anymore. Within a society, you do have that possibility for justice. You do have that possibility for agreed upon rules. And this again goes even further back than just our lecture on realism. You can link this to the discussions that we had on world order as well, and the distinctions that Nick Renger makes when he talks about controlling order, working within order, or emancipating order. Then we went on to talk about Adam Smith, and he talked about how individual self-interest can actually motivate you to be part of a greater public good. So there's again a different way of interpreting the state-individual relationship, and again how that comes through in Richard Cobden's ideas when he talks about a harmony between states. We then moved on to idealism, and we looked at the works of Hobson, well, very quickly, and he talked about how imperialism is the cause of conflict. And so what you needed to do was to work through this notion of imperialism and move towards a principle of self-determination. And if people were in charge of themselves and could make decisions for their own behalf, so within states, you could work towards a more calm, non-conflictual account of order. Again, we went and looked at Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, and I've given you a link on the slides because it is within this document that you really begin to see how that type of idea might come to be and how we could move towards a more collective approach to security within world order. We then went on to talk about liberal institutionalism, and I pointed out how NATO, the European Union, and even the United Nations can embody certain assumptions within this approach to understanding international relations. So because the core of all of this is this notion of transnational cooperation, and states invest a lot of time and energy into these institutions so that they can have some form of working order and back channels to work together to achieve shared outcomes. And you see this quite strongly in the integration theory of the European Union. So it is within this that you begin to see how new patterns of interaction, institutional channels, and different actors other than the state can come to work together. Now, all of these things are then reimagined when we look at the neo-interpretation. So, for example, in neoliberal internationalism, we looked at the writings of Doyle and how he uses Kant and the Kantian legacy to imagine how we can get non-liberal states to get along with liberal states. And he puts forward a dual-track approach. And we talked about the distinction between the first track, which is preserving a liberal community based on all of those values that we talked about at the beginning of the lecture, and then how you go on to expand a liberal world order through economic and diplomatic instruments. We then looked at Francis Fukuyama and the end of history and the last man, and what that meant for international relations, and we situated that within an understanding of an emerging out of a Cold War mentality. and we started to ask questions about the problems surrounding human rights and the promotion of democracy, and a lot of people brought up the idea that democracy might not always work, and we got back to the idea that it's individuals on the ground who would bear the brunt of conflict. We then went on to neo-idealism, and we looked at how the idea that peace and justice are something that have to be created, and that you need to have states helping with this project if you want it to work. But then we also invoked the challenges of universality and what that means for states that don't buy into this particular project. Finally, we looked at the idea of neo-idealism, and we looked at the writings of Richard Falk. And he started, and it was in his work that we looked at how we might begin to reimagine international institutions so that they can attend to what has been labeled the dark side of globalization, and that the problems with universal values in a world that is very fragmented. That being said, we then talked about the idea of emancipatory potential, and we linked that back to world order and how there are different ways that you can manage an international society. And then very briefly, I took you through 3 different authors, David Held, Daniel Archibugi, and Sheila Benhabib, and showed how their own particular interpretations of an international society allowed different ways of imagining an international society, in contrast to the thinkers that came before them. So I think that was pretty much where we ended, and I'm going to finish there.